Hey, what's going on, everyone? This is Loki Oren, and we're not exactly in Darkest Dungeon 2, but we're talking about Darkest Dungeon 2. This is the Darkest Dungeon 2 Trinket tier list as done by me. So, I've got a tier maker set up, and we're going to dive into that. But first, I want to get rid of a little bit of administration. So, first of all, what do the tier ratings mean, asterisk, to me? So, S tier. These trinkets are extremely high value, oftentimes best in slot or BIS. The standard I'm using here is I would fight Zone 1 Harvest Child for this trinket. Or in other words, there's very little I wouldn't do in the game to get this trinket. Next up, the A tier. These are trinkets that provide a ton of value, but maybe don't meet that best in slot criteria. I would go out of my way and take risks to secure this trinket, but maybe not a Zone 1 Harvest Child. B tier, these is kind of our middle of the road solid performers, definitely worth having and trying to get, but maybe not at the cost of risking a run or giving up on other objectives you might have. Next, C tier. These trinkets just aren't bad. They're C's. They're passing, and that's about all we can say about them. Basically, just filling an empty slot until something better comes along. D tier, I've reserved for what I'm calling niche players. These trinkets have a very specific use case that may or may not be valuable, but outside of that, they're not worth much. And finally, F tier. This is our garbage tier. These trinkets are so bad they may as well just read +2 hope. Also, let's talk about assumptions and biases. First of all, this tier list is based on the current, at the time of the recording, patch Beasts and Burdens. New patches almost certainly will alter ratings, especially as new regions and bosses are added. Next, this is ultimately my view of the trinkets, taken from my playstyle and my preferences. Your mileage may vary, and if you disagree with a rating, feel free to leave a comment below and talk to me about it. I'd love to hear your opinions, your feedback, and maybe it'll help me improve my own game. Or maybe we can get a discussion going about the relative merits of a trinket. Next up, with trinkets that have multiple tiers of power, I've consolidated them into one rating based on the top level of the trinket. Obviously, lower tiers of the trinkets perform worse, but look, there's over 120 trinkets in Darkest Dungeon 2, and this is already going to be a very crowded tier list without adding 3 of the same trinket for, a half dozen or more trinkets. Finally, Infernal runs dramatically alter the equation in Darkest Dungeon 2, particularly for low flame trinkets. My views are based on my project runs, where I'm attempting to beat the Chains of Denial with every named formation, and thus do not use the Infernal Torch. Where possible, I'll weigh in on how I think this trinket will perform differently in Infernal runs, but my experience there is a lot more limited. With that out of the way, let's go dive into Tier Maker and start making our list. Alright, here we are in Tier Maker, and you can see here we've got every single one of the Darkest Dungeon 2 trinkets. This took a lot of work because while all these images exist on the wiki, some of them are not connected to the right trinket, and the trinket abilities aren't necessarily filled in. So big shout out to Hall Taker on the Darkest Dungeon 2 Discord, who helped me put together the complete list of trinkets with all of their effects and was instrumental in helping me get this to its present state. But here we go. We've got S through F, and let's dive in. Our first trinket here is a Simple Flower. A Simple Flower is a leper exclusive trinket, and its effect is gain on miss, a block plus token. So, a Simple Flower, in the end, I put it in C tier, and the reason is missing is bad. You don't really want to be missing very much, but at least it goes on a character who misses a lot due to blind tokens and does a fair bit of tanking. So in the scheme of things, not the worst trinket, but I can't imagine carrying this very far, so C tier. Next up, Ablative Shield. This is the burn resistance trinket that does 10, 20, or 25% burn resistance. This goes straight into D tier. This is very much a niche player of a trinket. It's good in the sprawl, not really good anywhere else. So we're going to leave it in D tier. Because by the end of the run, I always find myself junking, particularly the lower tiers, but even the uppermost tier, the 25% version, just into the bin, +2 hope. Next up, Adrenalizing Ash. Adrenalizing Ash, this one might be a bit of a controversial choice, but I put this in B tier. And let me explain why. Its effect is start of turn, gain a strength token. Or not start of turn, sorry. Start of combat, gain a strength token. One strength token does not win a fight on its own. And in particular, it just doesn't move the needle very much. In a 5-round fight, this is effectively a 10% damage boost. Not awful, but not exciting either. So, B tier. Definitely not sad to see it, but not really going out of our way to get it. Next up is Anatomical Map. So Anatomical Map's effect is 12% crit chance, and we're just going to slot this right into A tier. 12% crit chance is nothing to sneeze at, but I don't think it really meets my Harvest Child standard. And that's really where I think it docks points, is it's very good, but I don't think I'd go fight a Zone 1 Harvest Child for it. I would just do a lot of other things for it. Next up, Anchoring Charm. Anchoring Charm is resistance trinket that does 10, 20, or 25% movement resistance. And maybe this is more useful on Infernal runs where ambushes are more common, but what I've found is that forced movement is very rarely an issue, and definitely not worth spending a trinket slot on. This goes into F tier for me. Next up, Annotated Textbook. This is a Plague Doctor exclusive trinket that provides plus 33% disease resistance. What is going to become a common theme here is a lot of the resistance tokens end up in D tier. Diseases aren't super common, and while some of them can be really devastating, a lot of them are kind of irrelevant. And the Plague Doctor has very high disease resistance baseline, so this just doesn't feel very exciting. Into D tier, it's a niche player if you've got a Plague Doctor that has maybe hypochondriac, or you're just really worried about diseases, but I can't imagine carrying it very far. Now we have Astroglass Flute. Turn start, heal 1 stress from a random party member, 25%. There's not much needs to be said here. This is S tier. Free stress healing, no requirements, no restrictions. Why wouldn't you want this? This, ignores any of the restrictions around stress healing. For example, that you have to be at 5 stress for a lot of options to take effect. It's basically a free dose of laudanum every 4th turn, applied to a random party member. Very hard to say this isn't going to be amazing in every run. I can imagine a scenario where you end up junking it at the end of a run, but that seems like it's kind of served its purpose. Next up, speaking of S tier, we've got Befuddling Sundial, and I'm not even going to hesitate. That goes straight in there. This is the highest value, the strongest heal at the start of turn trinket. Sundial's effect is at start of turn, heal 12% of max HP. And this is completely game breaking. It happens every turn and completely breaks how HP recovery is supposed to work in Darkest Dungeon 2. You're not supposed to get a continuous regen effect the whole time. This ranks not only S tier, this is probably triple S tier. I'd probably fight the Zone 1 Harvest Child twice just to get this thing. Though granted, at the end of that, I'm going to need it. But Befuddling Sundial, clearly S tier. Next up is Blistering Bugle. Turn start, taunt token, 25% chance. Taunt is a pretty good token, but most of the characters that you'll have tanking have ways to generate taunt. So not bad, but not really exciting either, and almost certainly to be replaced by a better trinket towards the end of the run. Next up is Bloodied Branch. Bloody Branch, it gives is Hellion exclusive and gives plus 33% bleed resistance. Of the many things Hellion cares about, bleed really isn't one of them. I'm giving it the D tier mostly on the grounds that it does mitigate a fairly common dot in especially cultist encounters. And maybe if you have a Hellion that has a quirk or disease that makes her prone to bleeding, this can help a little bit. But the truth is, with Adrenaline Rush healing bleeds anyway, this just doesn't feel very impactful. Next up is Bouncer's Belt. Bouncer's Belt is turn start, gain a block plus token, 15% chance. And this is going right into A tier. Free block plus tokens are awesome, but I don't know if I'd classify them as game breaking in power. Is a very solid trinket to have. You absolutely want to have this on your tanking characters, but probably not enough to go after the Zone 1 Harvest Child. So we're putting it in A tier. Next up, Brilliant Brew. This trinket gives plus 25% damage if your flame is greater than 60. So 25% damage is a lot of damage, but your flame has to be that high and stay that high, and that's quite difficult to do. Obviously, in Infernal runs, this thing is straight F tier because your flame's never going to be 60. But for a more normal run, this is a nice to have, but keep in mind, if your flame drops to 59, this trinket is now an empty slot. So I can't really justify putting it in S or A tier. So we'll put it in B tier, as that feels about right. Next up, Bulwark Band. Combat start, dodge plus token. So starting off combat with a free dodge plus is not bad at all, but I don't think it really passes the Harvest Child test. I'm putting it in A tier because I do feel like I would go for it through any of the normal quest or objectives, and I'd definitely fight Dreaming General or Librarian for it, but not passing the Harvest Child test, we're going to keep it in A tier. Next up, Busker's Hall. Jester exclusive trinket. On kill, extra action, 33%. So, Busker's Hall, I've kind of got I've cooled a lot on the on-kill trinkets. This one and Smoldering Hymnal. And the reason is that if you think about what an on-kill trinket can trigger, it can trigger up to 3 times in a fight. Which is a lot. 3 extra turns is quite a bit. But the only way to trigger it is on a kill. And the Jester is doing other things than just attacking every turn. He's often stress healing, buffing, debuffing, or dealing with daze after a big encore finale. Or a big, not encore finale, solo finale combo. So ultimately, I decided to put it in B tier, as this is definitely not something you're going to feel bad about having on the Jester. But you probably won't keep it till the end just because there are better effects to have than a chance for maybe 1 turn on the Chains fight. 1 extra action on the Chains fight. Coming up next is Buttressing Band. Sorry, I mixed my B's up here. Buttressing Band, turn start, dodge token, a dodge plus token, 15% chance. So, like its mate Bouncer's Belt, this is just a very strong token generating item. But it doesn't really cross into S tier because it isn't completely warping the game. It's just keeping your characters a little bit safer. Definitely don't mind having one. If you can get multiples, it's great to just have as many dodge plus tokens around as possible because that is a lot of damage mitigation. But I don't think I can put it in S tier. Next up, we have Calibrating Sense here, and I'm just going to put this right where it belongs, in the garbage. Gain on miss strength token. So first of all, missing is bad. Why would you want to do it? And while this does kind of give you a bit of a payoff in the form of a strength token, keep in mind that a strength token only does 50% extra damage. So unless you're kind of building around trying to have a way to miss and then set up a huge howling end or something, this just feels bad. I've yet to find a situation where this has felt good to me. And I think its description is much more accurately +2 hope and put something better in that slot. Next we have Carved Toy. Carved Toy is a runaway exclusive trinket, turn start dodge token +25%. And we're going to put this into B tier. Runaway is a pretty fragile character. But some extra tankiness is not to be overlooked, but you really don't want her taking a lot of hits. So it feels like this is sort of correcting a problem that you don't want your runaway to have. But that being said, you're not going to feel bad carrying this to the end because it will give you, some extra tankiness. Next we have Celebrated Chalice. If relics greater than 35 get a speed token on turn start. This may as well read, if you're rich, go first. A sad, sad reflection of our capitalist world. But in game, it is going into B tier. Maybe this is just my bias, but I'm not a very big fan of speed tokens. It feels like they can definitely be high impact in kind of key moments, but they're not necessarily something that I want to go out of my way to generate. It's just nice to have them when they show up. So that's why it got docked a few points and ended up in B tier. Next up, Charred Litany, plus 50% burn resistance. The humor with this trinket is the way to get it is defeating the Librarian. The Librarian is the single largest burn boss in the game, so you've already proven that burn isn't an issue. But now here's a trinket that makes burn less of a problem. It doesn't feel very good. It does make a future zone in the sprawl pretty easy for one character who just, at that point their burn resistance is probably in the 80s. But again, very niche, not something that you'd want to invest a trinket slot in long term. Next up, Clandestine Cape. Combat start. Gain a stealth token. This is going into what I would call a conditional B tier. Stealth is not a very good token right now. It is not very well engined in Darkest Dungeon 2. The only character who makes use of it is Grave Robber. And even she, is not that good at using stealth. She just uses it better than anybody else. So this is very much not going to make it into the A or S tier. And really the only reason it's getting B tier is because the Grave Robber makes a ton of usage out of this, particularly in setting up repartee if you're using a tank robber. But otherwise, probably something you're going to bin fairly regularly. Next up, Clarifying Carcanet or Carcanet. I'm not sure which way it's supposed to be said. If relics greater than 35, blind token on hit, 25% chance. So I love this trinket. It is solidly S tier for me. A ready source of blind tokens is amazing, and the fact that this hits on AoEs and items means that you can very quickly swing a fight in your favor with just a little bit of luck, and over the course of a run, this is going to mitigate serious damage. Put it in S tier, give it to your Plague Doctor, and never look back. Next up, the Cleansing Sensor. This is the disease resistance trinket that gives 10, 20, 25% disease resistance, and as you're probably guessing, straight into D tier. Again, if you're worried about diseases, this can fill a slot, but outside of that niche use case, this just is +2 hope. It's just not worth investing that much time in. Next we have we have Cleansing, Next up, we have Cleansing Clasp. Lost my place in my document here. Cleansing Clasp. If relics greater than 35, plus, I believe it's 33% blight resistance. I actually have a question mark here. But in the end, it is going into D tier for the same reasons above. Blight is not a very common damage over time effect, and much like bleed and burn, which we've already talked about, unless you're in a zone or a fight where that is extremely relevant, this is basically just an empty slot. Use maybe in the fodder, but otherwise just kick it to the curb plus 2 hope. Next up, Clenching Claws plus 33% move resist. And again, this might be a bit controversial because I don't value move resistance very highly, but I'm putting this in F tier. Maybe it belongs. I could be convinced that it belongs in D tier as a niche player, but I just don't see but movement resistance as being very high value. So this just reads as plus 2 hope to me. Next up, Clotting Cruor, I think is how that's said. 10, 20, 25% bleed resistance. We've talked about this plenty. Straight into D tier. It's a bit player, but ultimately not one that you're going to use much outside of basically cultist battles. Next up, Corrupted Bile Gland plus 20% bleed, blight, and burn chance. So this is a very strong trinket, but I dock it a few points because really the only character that can use it effectively is the Plague Doctor, and only in some formations, because she can do bleed, blight, and burn. Otherwise, this is just, it's helping one facet of a character, and the other two effects are basically wasted. Ultimately, I think A tier is where it belongs. It's a very strong effect, improving your dot output, but maybe not one that you're going to fight a Zone 1 Harvest Child for. Next up, and kind of for the same reasons going in the same place, is Corrupting Cleaver, which is plus 25% blight chance. Amazing on the Plague Doctor, decent on the Grave Robber, but that kind of limited use case means a lot of times if you don't have those two characters, you're binning this thing. And even with those two characters, I don't think you're fighting Zone 1 Harvest Child for it. So we'll put it into A tier. Next up is Covert Cloak. Turn start, gain a stealth token, 10% chance. So this is a bit of an odd one, but even though this is the quote better version of Clandestine Cape, I'm actually ranking it lower and putting it in C tier. And here's why. Turn start stealth token, 10% chance. So stealth is already of limited use. At best, you're shedding damage onto other characters, or you're the Grave Robber and you actually have skills that use it. But the fact that it's only a 10% chance means that it's rarely going to be up when you need it. And the Grave Robber wants to start in stealth, set up repartee or do her combo, and hopefully by then something has died and she can Dead of Night and do it again. So it's not a bad trinket, and you're not going to be sad to have it on your Grave Robber. But I would rate the Clandestine Cloak higher, and the fact that stealth is just such a bad token right now, neither of them really make the mark. Next up, the first of our cultist trinkets is Cruel Intent. If Dark Impulse is equipped, plus 12% crit chance. Now, it might be odd, and it kind of sounds odd to put this in C tier when Anatomical Map, which is literally the same effect, is in A tier. But here's why. That's 2 trinket slots to get Cruel Intent. It's Dark Impulse plus the 12 plus Cruel Intent. And that's just very bad. You don't, as good as crit is, as amazing as crit is, you don't want to spend both trinket slots for just 12% crit. You'd much rather have Anatomical Map and something, or even something like a lesser crit trinket and another trinket in place. So putting it in C tier. Next up, Curing Cuppa, straight into D tier, plus 25% blight resistance. Decent in the fodder, doesn't really move the needle anywhere else, so just put it where it belongs. Cursed Coin, a Highwayman exclusive trinket, plus 8% crit chance. This one might be a bit controversial for folks, but I'm putting this in B tier. And the reason is it's only 8% crit, and the Highwayman has Take Aim, which is something he naturally wants to do for the removal of blind, the free crit token, and the and if you upgrade it, the speed token. Meaning that the Highwayman, as good as improving his crit chance is, he's already going to be critting a lot. So I just don't feel like it moves the needle as much as, say, generating strength tokens on him or improving his survivability or, one of the countless other effects that you could be doing. So B tier. Next up, Dead Ringer. Straight into S tier with you. So this is like Clarifying Carcinet is a on hit trinket. Apply on hit a stun token plus 15% chance. Or a 15% chance. So the only thing better than blinding the enemy is stunning them. This is limited somewhat by the stacking buff that enemies and the characters get that makes chain stunning impossible. But that being said, a couple of key stuns can really turn a fight around, and just applying it on an AoE with either an item or something like Magnesium Rain makes this incredibly strong. So this is straight into S tier. This could theoretically carry a run on its own. Next up, we have Disarming Dagger. Apply on hit, vulnerable token, 15% chance. And this is going into A tier. And the reason it's going into A tier rather than S is vulnerable tokens are great, don't get me wrong. Increasing damage by 50% is pretty awesome. And there's a lot of burst potential there, but because it's a chance on hit, it's not always going to line up the perfect combo, and it doesn't matter if the enemy's vulnerable, they still get to hit you. So it's very good, but I don't think it meets the Harvest Child standard, so putting it in A tier. Next up, Distracting Dust. This is another on-hit trinket. This one applying Daze tokens at a 15% chance. This one goes into B tier for me. And the reason is that Daze is a nice token to apply, but since it doesn't actually eliminate the enemy's turn, it just slows them down. This feels a little bit worse than stunning or blinding them. And unless you're in a situation where you can blitz down the person dazed, this ends up just kind of changing the turn order slightly and doesn't feel powerful enough to be A or S tier. Let me just move on my spreadsheet here. There we go. Next up is Early Experiment. This is another Plague Doctor exclusive, giving plus 33 blight resistance, and no surprise to anybody, straight into D tier. Plague Doctor already has high blight resistance baseline, and blight is not a super common dot outside of the Fodor, basically. So this just doesn't feel very impactful. It's definitely something that's worth having, or worth putting on if you have it and you're in a situation where you need the blight resistance, but otherwise, basically a niche player, plus 2 hope most of the time. Next, we have Empty Stein, a Hellion exclusive trinket, if rank 1 plus 25% damage. Well, Hellion wants to be in the front rank, and this encourages her to be basically where she wants to be. Between toe-to-toe and Howling End, plus 25% damage is quite a bit extra. But I think it just misses out on the Harvest Child standard, and the reason is that the Hellion already hits incredibly hard. This is more of that's a very nice luxury to have than a gotta have it, do anything to get it. So I'd definitely go out of my way to get it, but I don't think I'd fight Zone 1 Harvest Child for it. Next up, Enlightening Element, Gain on Miss, crit token. This is F tier for me. Just like Calibrating Censure, missing is bad. Why would you want to do it? This is slightly better than Calibrating Censure because at least a crit token doubles damage, but you still end up in the same situation of there are better things to be doing than missing with an attack and hoping next turn to basically get back to even. So for me, F tier, basically just plus 2 hope. Next, we have Eyes of the Void. If your flame is lower than 40, gain a crit token at start of turn, 25% chance. So for my tier list, this is B tier. And allow me to explain. In my runs, I'm not using the Infernal Flame, so this is only going to be valid part of the time. But when it is valid, this is mechanically a 25% chance to crit by generating that crit token. That's pretty incredible. But where this really shines, this is solidly S tier in an Infernal run, where that the flame is locked at 1, so this is basically just plus 25% chance to crit. Amazing in Infernal runs, only so-so in normal runs, which is what this tier list is for. Next up, Faceless Visage. Turn start, taunt token, 20%. Just like its mate, Blistering Bugle, we can actually put them next to each other. Isn't that cute? If only the horn was turned the other way, he could be playing a little trumpet. Taunt token is a pretty good token to generate, but most of your tanks already have ways to generate them. Plenty good, but probably not one that you're going to carry all the way to the end. More of a gap filler than a carry. Next, we have Fate's Foreteller. Combat start, gain a crit token, 15% chance. So this is not a very good trinket, and I'm putting it in C tier, and here's why. A crit token is very good, but this is combat start, maybe get a crit token. So it's not a 15% crit chance. It's a 15% crit chance on your first turn. The next 4 turns after that, it's not doing anything. It's basically a dead slot. And for that, it's basically just gap filler. I'm not giving it the F tier because I would use this thing and use it for some time because those crit tokens do add up. But it's just not very good, and you're going to look to replace it with something that's going to have more impact immediately. Next up, Footman's Grog. This is going straight into F tier. And let me tell you why. Its effect, on death's door, extra action, 75% chance. Okay, so that's kind of nice. If you get put to death's door, you have a 3 and 4 chance of getting an extra action. Neat. Why would you want to be at death's door? How does triggering this keep you alive versus just not being there? Maybe there's something I'm missing, but this does not feel like a winning combo. And getting put to death's door is always bad, so let's avoid that at all if at all possible. Okay, next up to the plate is Foreclosure Notice. This is a Grave Robber exclusive, and it reads Self on Crit. Extra action, 25% chance. So Grave Robber crits a lot, and extra actions on her aren't bad either. Certainly an amazing trinket, but I don't think it passes the Harvest Child test. Having your Grave Robber crit is already very good, and extra actions feel kind of like a win more. So you definitely want to have this because she will crit plenty, but I wouldn't fight the Zone 1 Harvest Child for it. After that, we've got From Beyond. If your flame is below 40, plus 25% max HP. So this is going into C tier for me. Max HP is one of the stats that I value the least. It doesn't feel like it's going to save you. The damage output from enemies is high enough that a little bit of, 25% max HP is a hit or two. Now, I have seen there are plenty of people who've, made truly chonky lepers that, have 100 plus HP, and that's pretty cool. But it doesn't feel like on your normal run, that's what you're going to be trying to do. So this is a C tier for me normally. In Infernal runs, I'd probably upgrade it to a B tier. And the reason is I still don't think max HP is that good of a stat to stack. But if you can guarantee your flame's going to be low so this thing is always on, it is plus 25% max HP. It's not nothing. So C tier for this tier list. Next, we have Galvanizing Goblet. When healed, extra action, 25% chance. And let's just put this on up in S tier because I love extra actions, for the record. Any trinket that gives extra actions is definitely getting a look from me. But this one is especially good because when healed, I mean, if you're healing somebody, or, ideally you have something like Befuddling Sundial, that's good. You want to be doing that. You want to make sure your characters are staying alive. So if they get a heal and then immediately get an action off it, that's huge. Again, breaking, I've talked about in my other videos, breaking action economy is a big deal. And this helps you break action economy by healing somebody and then immediately getting an attack, basically as if the heal was a free turn. Very, very top quality, absolutely worth fighting the Harvest Child for. Speaking of speaking of healing at start of turn, Ghastly Gruel. Turn start, heal 25% of max HP, 25% chance. This will go right next to Galvanizing Goblet, as healing 25% of your max HP is insane, even if it only happens 25% of the time. And the fact that this is just going to sit and proc every single turn start is insane. Incredibly high value, absolutely worth fighting the Harvest Child for. Would dearly love to have this on every run. Next we have Gilded Mind, plus 5, 10, 15% stress resistance. And this is going into C tier. Of the, most of the resistance trinkets I've been fairly cool on, putting them in the D tier as niche players. Gilded Mind is one of the ones I don't do, or I rate a little higher, I should say, because stress is something you will deal with through all the regions, all the zones. So it at least has a wider application than something like Charred Litany, which is only good in the Sprawl. I will say that the reason it doesn't rank higher than C tier is you are going to use this until you find better trinkets or until stress stops being an issue, which usually happens towards the end of a run when you've got all your positive relationships and you're most of your positive relationships and you're in a good place. So it just ends up not being that impactful to winning the run, but like I said, you're not sad to have it. But, maybe you're not super excited either. So, feels like C tier. Good gap fill until something better comes along. Next up, the Gnarly Knuckles. Plus 15, 20, 25% melee damage, or damage to melee skills. And we'll go ahead and put this up in A tier. Obviously, there's a bit of nuance here because this is good on characters that have melee attacks and bad on characters who don't. But the fact that pretty much every character has a melee attack, and a lot of them focus exclusively on melee, thinking about characters like the Leper, like the Hellion, the Highwayman can be built that way, particularly with the Rogue Hero Path. I believe it's Rogue is what it's called. There's quite a lot of value in melee damage. The reason it doesn't make S tier for me is it's a lot of damage, but if you actually break out the numbers, it's not a lot of damage in any one fight. It's just a lot of damage kind of spread out. Any individual attack, you're talking about increasing damage by 1 or 2 versus increasing it by, doubling it with a crit token. So we're going to put it in A tier as definitely a high performer, but not one that we're going to fight a Zone 1 Harvest Child for. Next up, the Goading Gargoyle. If flame less than 40, plus 5 speed. Speed is the other stat, along with max HP, that I don't rate very highly. And the reason is that speed is kind of got a diminishing returns to it. The way initiative works, all the characters roll, I believe it is a D6. I think it used to be a D8. So they roll a D6 and add their speed score to it. So this is basically saying your speed is D6 plus 5 plus whatever their base speed is. That's pretty good if it's active. You're basically guaranteed to go first. But the thing is, if you win initiative by 1 or you win it by 8, you still win. and that's all that matters. So it ends up not being, it's kind of like if you have enough speed, this ends up just being a wasted trinket slot. Factoring in an Infernal Run, I would rate this more into the B tier, just because, if it's active all the time, it's just 5 + 5 speed. That seems pretty good. But I still don't rate speed as a stat very highly. So we're going to keep it in the middle here, the C to B tier, depending on your Infernal Run calculus. Next up, Grim Mask. Plus 40% damage, but plus 30% chance of negative affinity changes. It took a little bit of waffling around to think about this, but I ultimately decided to put this into A tier, and I'll say why. 40% damage is nuts. That is a lot of damage output. We talked about Gnarly Knuckles being, +1 +2. This is more like +2 +3, and it's, on everything. It's very substantial. And it feels like that is, going to definitely cross the threshold into knocking down big enemies or getting them down to death's door quicker. But the -33 affinity changes is kind of scary, which is what keeps it out of S tier. I will say late game, if you're very stable with your relationships, maybe this becomes more S tier as kind of like a good finisher to slam in after you've used whatever other trinkets to the chains fight, and then you put in Grim Mask for the kind of the final fight. But until affinity doesn't matter to you, this is kind of a weaker, has some weakness to it. So A tier is where I ended up putting it. Next up, Guarding Gauntlet. Combat start, block plus token. So it might seem a bit odd to have Guarding Gauntlet rank below Bouncer's Belt, considering this is just a flat, start of combat, get a block plus, and this is not necessarily Bouncer's Belt, but Bulwark Band, which is a dodge plus token versus a block plus token. And the reason for that is basically that I rate dodge higher than block. Both are very good, 75% damage versus 75% chance to just dodge something. But I think my preference is to have I would rather just not get hit by the attack, because a lot of attacks carry dots, carry debuffs, carry other things with them, and just stepping out of the way of that is better than taking it on the chin. So I ranked Guarding Gauntlet a little bit lower, but that's definitely one that I'm a little bit of a gray area around. It probably could be an A tier as well, and I wouldn't feel too bad about it. But I think B tier is where it belongs to me. Next up, Hag's Horde plus 20% max HP. I've already talked a bit about why I don't think max HP is a very good stat to stack. I know there's the meme of the chonky boy leper, but the truth is, like, plus 20% HP on a lot of characters is going to be, call it 3 or 6, somewhere in that ballpark extra HP. Or 3, so it's probably like 6-ish extra HP for a lot of characters. On the leper, it's more like 12. That's a hit or two, a hit or two. So it's definitely not bad, but I just don't feel like that's the game Darkest Dungeon 2 is playing. You don't want to survive the enemy's attacks. You want to have just enough survivability to kill them. So you're better off having a way to make blinds, make crit tokens, do extra damage, mitigate the damage rather than just taking it to the face. That being said, Hag's Horde, not bad. And the next trinket, Hail Draught, is just Hag's Horde's slightly weaker cousin, which does 10, 15, 20% max HP. Same exact description. Helps you ramp early, but I always feel like I replace these fairly quickly once anything better comes along. Next up, Hardened Heart. If Dark Impulse is equipped, plus 50% blight resistance. Now, this might seem a bit odd, but it's F tier to me. And here's why. Plus 50% blight resistance is a lot, don't get me wrong, but you're spending 2 trinket slots to mitigate a damage over time effect that's not that common? That's awful. Who pays for that crap? That's straight F tier to me. That is plus 2 hope and get out of my wagon levels. Next up, Hastening History, plus 4 speed. And much like Goading Gargoyle with its plus 5 speed, I also rate Hastening History into the C tier. And maybe this is my bias speaking that I just don't rate speed that highly. But ultimately, it doesn't feel like speed is a stat you want to stack as high as you want to stack, say, damage output. So it's a good thing to have if you don't have a better trinket to put in that place. Say you've got a bunch of lower level trinkets or just kind of random resistance stuff. But once you find one of the B tier or A tier, you're almost always going to drop Hastening History to do that. The one kind of maybe niche application is if you need to set up a combo. So say you need your Jester to set up a combo so your Leper can hit through blind, or so you can do something cool with Grave Robber and a crit. Maybe Hastening History gains more value in that situation, but for the most part, I don't rate speed very highly. I'd say C tier. Next up, we have the Heart-Shaped Padlock, and this is going straight into A tier. The Heart-Shaped Padlock's effect plus 33% chance of positive affinity changes. 33% positive affinity changes is amazing, especially early on. That's huge value to help you build up those initial positive relationships. It does fall off in value as you get later in the run, which may make it seem a bit odd that it's rated in S, but I think getting it early and having it build up all of your relationships and then you discard it right before the end is a very good usage of it. And that to me seems like something that can be very strong. Fighting Zone 1 Harvest Child, to know that for the rest of the run I'm going to get positive affinity ticks left, right, and center feels amazing. I'd rate it as S tier. Next up, the Heartseeker. This is the crit trinket that provides 2, 4, and 6% crit chance. And this is going straight into C tier. It's not that crit is bad. I don't think these trinkets are bad, but its effect just feels kind of a bit like a placebo. 2% crit, 4% crit, even 6% crit just doesn't feel splashy enough. And it's kind of like you put it on and then wonder if it actually is working. We could, you could make the statement that Heartseeker is bugged and doesn't actually do anything, and I wouldn't have any way to refute it because it's just such a kind of narrow effect and it's difficult to see. Next up, Hierarchy of Sights, plus 33% bleed resistance. This is going straight into D tier for the reasons we discussed. It's a niche player providing resistance to a dot that's fairly common, has some use there, but otherwise it's just not worth dying for. It's just, there's other ways to go about it. Next up, Hint of Home. And this is going straight into S tier, and we'll actually let's pile all these guys up together because they make me happy and they deserve to be together. But Hint of Home is the weakest of the 3 turn start heal trinkets, but that's a kind of a relative statement because it's still incredibly powerful. So its effect is heal 10% of max HP, 25% chance on turn start. So it's a weaker Ghastly Gruul, but keep in mind that's still 10% max HP just happening, just for free. That's pretty impactful. For just picking a character up, keeping them in the fight, making sure they don't hit death's door, or getting them a little extra heal prior to that next big node. In a recent run, I did this with Ghastly Gruul where I was bopping it around between characters, just trying to keep characters high on HP and concentrating damage onto the character I knew had the most resources for healing and was the tank, the man-at-arms in this case, so that I could then put it on him and just tank all the damage. So Hint of Home, very strong, definitely S tier. Absolutely would fight the Harvest Child for it. Next up is His Rings. Gain when hit, strength token, 33% chance. And this is a Grave Robber exclusive trinket. And this goes into B tier for me. The Grave Robber is a bit fragile to be intentionally getting hit to try to generate strength tokens. And keep in mind that strength tokens are much weaker than crit tokens, 50% versus 100% more damage. But the Grave Robber does have a fair amount of healing with Dead of Night and Absinthe, so this isn't bad on her. Definitely not a bad trinket to put in the slot until something better comes along. You know, feels like B tier to me. Next up, Idle Thought. If Dark Impulse is equipped, plus 50% burn resistance. And this is going right next to its mate. F tier. 50% burn resistance is a lot, but outside of the sprawl, you never need this. It's 2 trinket slots for 50%. You know, there's plenty of resistance that give 25 to 33% for 1 trinket slot. So this is not even giving you much of a bonus rate or anything for only having the 1 trinket active. It just feels like garbage. It's, very narrow use case. Maybe I think in the past I've used it in the sprawl on occasion when I just wanted to mitigate as much burn as possible, but it doesn't feel particularly good. I would say this is +2 hope 95% of the time. Next up is Inert Indicia, I think is how it's meant to be said, which is the stun resistance trinket. It does 10, 20, and 25% stun resistance at its highest level. And of all the resistance trinkets, this is the one that gets the A tier nod. And let me explain why. So I'm pretty cool, I'm pretty, negative on the resistance trinkets as a whole. The one exception is Inert Indicia because of how stun heavy the Chains of Denial fight is. Because stuns are such a big part of that fight, grabbing as many of these trinkets as possible, and I've had runs where I have 2 or 3 of them going into the mountain. That is incredibly powerful to just swap in those trinkets and get your stun resistance that little bit higher. This combined with Clarifying Poultice can easily put a character over 100 stun resistance, which means that they're almost never going to get stunned. So definitely for me, A tier. Keeping out of stuns is very strong, and this is the best trinket to do it with. Next up, Inevitable End. This is a leper exclusive trinket. Combat start, gain a strength token, 50% chance. And unfortunately, this is going into C tier. The leper does benefit quite a bit from strength tokens. He hits quite hard. But the fact that it's a 50-50 to get a strength token, and on top of that, the leper is blind a lot of times on their first turn, just means that this isn't an effect that is very immediately powerful. It takes a lot of setup just to get to the point where the leper is going to be able to use his strength token. And, some percentage of the time it's not going to hit even then. So it just feels not very strong. More filler than actual value. Next up, Insulating Insignia. If rank 1, plus 15% debuff resistance. So I'm a little bit unsure about how to rate debuff resistance. My bias is that it's not the most valuable stat, but I do feel like this has quite a bit of value on the leper in particular, who wants to be in rank 1 most of the time and can resist at least some of his blind causing skills with debuff resistance. So that's what puts it into the B tier, but I'm a little unsure how to rate debuff resistance, so that's one that I expect to fluctuate in future patches and future developments. Next up is Kitchen Knives, plus 33% blight resistance. This is going straight into D tier for reasons talked about before. Blight just isn't common enough to justify the slot. And this also feels kind of like a slap in the face, because I believe this is one of the trinkets that you have to beat the Harvest Child to get. And this is not a good payout for the Harvest Child. That is a hard fight to get something that's, basically +2 hope most of the time. Next up, we have Knitted Blanket. This is a runaway exclusive trinket that provides +50% burn resistance. And this one is going to get a very reluctant D tier from me. And here's the reason I'm reluctant. The runaway already has very high burn resistance. That's kind of her thing. So getting more burn resistance on her doesn't feel great to begin with. But on top of that, like, why are we spending an entire trinket slot to get really high burn resistance, which is only good in the sprawl? Which incidentally is a zone that the runaway isn't very good in. So yeah, in the end, D tier because it does have a narrow use case if you're trying to mitigate a lot of burn, but otherwise I'd just junk it most of the time. Next we have Laden Lantern, which will go straight into A tier. Much like its mates Corrupting Cleaver and Corrupted Bile Gland, plus it provides +25% burn chance. That's a very strong effect. This is amazing on the runaway and pretty good on the Plague Doctor. But the fact that it has kind of a limited use case to just those two characters, and that its effect is impactful but not game breaking, keeps it out of the S tier. I definitely try to get a Laden Lantern whenever I'm running the runaway, but otherwise I think it stays in A tier for me. Next up, we have Locked Jaw. If Dark Impulse is equipped, +33% stress resistance. So go ahead and put Locked Jaw where it belongs, right into D tier. This feels a bit too niched to me, but it might save a meltdown, so I kind of waffled about putting it in either F tier or D tier and decided to err on the side of D tier. It's probably better just not to get into a stress situation where 33% stress resistance is going to matter. But the fact that it eats up 2 trinket slots just feels bad. So ultimately, that's what keeps it out of the higher tiers and makes it kind of this niche player. Next up, we have Misstep. If Dark Impulse is equipped, +40% max HP. We've talked a bit already about max HP and how I don't rate it very highly. 40% is quite a bit of max HP. I mean, for the Leper, you're talking about 24, I believe, max HP. So that's several hits for sure. But you're spending 2 trinket slots to get it, and there are better things to be doing than just making your beefy boy beefier. So C tier for me, more filler than real value. Next up, we have Mortal Ward. +3, 6, or 9% death blow resistance. This, like a lot of its compatriots, is going into D tier for me. Death blow resistance is a weird stat because it has a hard cap of 90%, and if you're playing a normal run and getting positive relationships and not dealing with a ton of bad luck, you probably are getting pretty close to that cap anyway. So the Mortal Ward feels like it has some value early, just if you have a character that's low, just kind of giving you a little extra edge. But by the mid or late part of a run, this is just +2 hope because your character should already be at or close to maxed death blow resistance. Next, we have the Obsidian Drone Pipe. Turn start, stun a random enemy, +25% chance. And yeah, you better believe this is going right into S tier next to its other pipe-looking friend here. Let me just adjust this a little bit. Yeah, stuns are amazing. Stunning an enemy is always good. Making them skip a turn is always good. And not getting to target it is kind of sad, but otherwise this trinket reads as 25% chance on start a turn, make the enemy skip their turn. Hard to refuse that. Next up, we have Oversprung Pocket Watch, +6 speed. I mean, what do you say? I mean, gotta go fast. It's definitely true. That's a pretty heavy amount of speed. And I ultimately put it in B tier. That is a ton of speed. That's basically win initiative, automatically speed. But, as discussed, Going fast won't save you every time, and it feels like something where this just doesn't move the needle enough for me to be excited about it. It's not bad, it's just not particularly good, I'd say. Now, maybe I'm wrong, and comment section below if you think that speed is the god stat, but I just don't see it. All right, next we've got a Parrying Patriarch. Turn start block token plus 25% chance. This one for me goes straight into B tier. We can put it right next to its fellow block generating buddy. It may be odd that a block plus token is rating the same as repeated block tokens, but that is kind of how I feel about it. Free block tokens are not bad at all. Love having it, but I almost always end up replacing it as I get a better option. So the Parrying Patriarch is just solidly B tier to me. It's a solid, good performer, but almost always ends up being replaced by something splashier. Next up is Peculiar Pods. A lot of P's. This provides plus 25% disease resistance, and you guessed it, straight into D tier with you. Nothing wrong with it per se. I mean, disease resistance is a stat, but diseases are very bad, but they're not common enough to make spending a trinket slot feel good. And there are better trinket slot or trinkets for disease resistance as well. So ultimately, this just doesn't feel like much more than a niche player. And even that, I think, is a stretch. Next up, the Pile of Ash, plus 25% burn chance. And we'll put this right next to its mate, Laden Lantern. Pile of Ash is a runaway exclusive trinket, but it does exactly what Laden Lantern does. So an excellent trinket if you're running the runaway, which I think is the only time that this trinket will appear. But otherwise, it's probably not worth dying over. So that's why it doesn't rank the S tier. Still a very strong trinket to have, though. Next up, the Price of Pride. And it's been a while since we had one, but here comes our next S tier. What to say about the Price of Pride? Well, its effect is splashy. Gain when hit. Extra action, 15% chance. So the Man-at-Arms is all about being punched in the head. That's basically his entire kit, is getting punched in the head. And this synergizes really well with getting him punched in the head. So it's a match made in heaven. This is incredibly powerful on the Man-at-Arms because you're just going to set up Retribution, get your riposte stacks, and it's just going to be smack, 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 smack. I have seen, and granted it was getting lucky, but you can have turns where the Man-at-Arms gets to swing 2 or 3 times easily, just off the back of getting hit and getting an extra action. Definitely S tier for me. Next up, Prodding Pendant. Turn start, speed token, 15% chance. Just like Oversprung Pocket Watch, I rate this at a B for kind of the same reasons. Speed tokens are slightly better than raw speed score because speed tokens, I don't know the math behind it, but they just translate to win initiative, basically. But the fact that it only has a 15% chance of happening, and speed tokens happen on your next turn, so it's basically like your next turn you go first. Just doesn't feel splashy enough or powerful enough to be an A or S tier. So honestly, I'd almost rank the Oversprung Pocket Watches higher. So if I think about it more, the Prodding Pendant might be creeping down into C tier, but I think the fact that it generates a token that does have a pretty clear impact lets it sneak into B tier as a solid trinket to have, but not one you're gonna, shout for joy over. Next up is Protectorate. This is a trinket that provides the debuff resistance option. It's plus 5, 10, or 15% debuff resistance. And this is one where I recognize my bias here. I rated it in D tier as kind of a niche player, very good on the leper, not necessarily good anywhere on anyone else. But I recognize that I may have a biased view of debuff resistance, and it might be better than that. But the truth is, even if I did rate debuff resistance higher, this wouldn't be getting more than a probably B tier, because at some point you just need to be doing damage. You just need to be, either mitigating damage or doing damage. And it's just not a splashy enough effect. And 15% is dangerously close to placebo levels, but I think is still above placebo levels. Next up, we have Proxy Doll. Turn start, gain a crit token, 15% chance. So this will go straight into S tier. And here's why. Crit tokens, mechanically speaking, turn start, gain a crit token, 15% chance, is basically the same as saying you have a 15% chance to crit, making it better than the anatomical map on any one, on any single turn. Now, there is some nuance there because the anatomical map is stacking on top of existing skills' crit chances. But remember that those skills still have crit chances without anatomical maps, so I think it all kind of mathematically washes out. And in the end, what pushes this over the top is when the crit token is generated, so you can adjust your strategy and play around taking advantage of it. And it's a continuous stream of crit tokens. And in a game like Darkest Dungeon 2, which is currently all about damage output, free crit tokens are huge damage output. Next up is the Pulsating Heart. Plus 15% death blow resistance on turn start. Gain a 2x3, so bleed for 2 for 3 rounds, 8% chance. Yeah, we're going to go ahead and just put this straight in F tier. This thing is garbage. And here's why. Its positive benefit is a stat that I've already talked about being not one that you necessarily want to stack late, because you shouldn't need to. Your character should all have north of 80, probably hitting 90 the death blow resistance cap anyway. So this trinket isn't really helping you, and it's actively trying to kill you. It's actively trying to kill you with bleeds. This is bad. Even putting on a bleed resistance trinket doesn't make this good. So yeah, F tier. This is straight 2 hope into the ground. Next up is Rat Skull, the one of the Highwayman's exclusive trinkets. Gain on miss crit token. So this may be a bit of a controversial pick, but I rate this in F tier, and here's why. The Highwayman already has take aim to generate crit tokens and get rid of blinds. So the Highwayman isn't missing very often already, and you really don't want him to be missing. The only other way he misses is with dodge tokens, and if you're running tracking shot, you can get rid of those too. So it just feels like Rat Skull doesn't have a place in the way I play Highwayman. And you just don't want him missing his shots. So why would you want to slot in a token that only rewards you when you miss the thing you don't want to do? So yeah, F tier. Next up, we have Raven's Reach, which is the ranged counterpart to Gnarly Knuckles. It does the 15, 20, 25% damage to range skills. This is amazing on range-centric characters, just like Gnarly Knuckles is for melee, and we'll put it right next with its buddy. And all the things I said about Gnarly Knuckles are true for Raven's Reach, with the slight caveat that it feels like there are fewer ranged characters than melee characters, but there aren't many formations that don't have at least one person attacking with ranged attacks, so Raven's Reach just feels good, and 25% damage is nothing to sneeze at, even if it is kind of relatively small and keeps it out of that S tier on any one individual fight. It's still definitely worth having, and one I can definitely see taking all the way to the end. Next up, Reverberating Redoubt. We'll just put this straight into S tier right next to Price of Pride. Everything I said about Price of Pride is true about Reverberating Redoubt. Reverberating Redoubt is just better. So Reverberating Redoubt is gain when hit, extra action, 33% chance. So again, the Man-at-Arms probably uses it best because he is all about getting punched in the head, and is very consistent in getting his taunt tokens. But even on the Leper or the Hellion, or heck, any character that's getting hit somewhat consistently, this is just free extra actions. Reverberating Redoubt is nuts, and I would probably rate close closer to Befuddling Sundial than I would to some of the other S tiers with how good Reverberating Redoubt is. But we didn't make a double S or triple S tier, so Reverberating Redoubt decidedly S tier. Next, the Rotten Tomato. Turn start, crit token, 25% chance. And this is exclusive to the Hellion. And like Proxy Doll, it's also going to end up in the S tier. Because that is, mechanically speaking, a 25% crit chance on a character that has a big, huge, splashy skill like Howling End. So this just feels extremely strong, and it's a turn start trinket, so it can just keep happening. There is a slight caveat to that there is the possibility that it'll generate a crit token on a turn that you're not able to use Howling End, but that still feels okay. It's just a ton of extra damage output for your Hellion and potential stress healing with that 50/50. So it just feels very strong, and I would definitely fight the Zone 1 Harvest Child to get it if I was running the Hellion. Next up, the Rousing Recorder. And hey, look, we've just got a little collection of speed trinkets here. And yeah, I think that it's the same things I said about Oversprung Pocket Watch go to Rousing Recorder, which is if you are in rank 4 plus 5 speed. So slightly worse than Oversprung Pocket Watch, but not by too much. And it's the same story. It's not a bad trinket, it's not a bad stat, but it just doesn't feel like it's that high value. Next up is Rousing Ringer. This is if your flame is less than 40 plus 33% stun resistance. And this we will put... Originally I thought B tier, but I actually think I'm going to pull back slightly and put it in C tier. And I'll explain my reasoning why here. So the last several times I've gone to the Chains fight, I've had my flame north of 50. And I've been able to get that somewhat consistently. So as long as we can't manipulate the Flame of Hope, it's not very easy to make sure that this is active. And if you're not in the Chains fight, stuns just aren't very common. So Rousing Ringer just doesn't feel very impactful. It's not bad. I mean, you wouldn't mind having it in the slot while it's empty. But as soon as you find something better, I think you replace it, unless you're able to get your flame down to 40 for the Chains fight. Now, other caveat to this, if you're running on Infernal, this thing's amazing. 33% stun resistance in the chain fight, guaranteed. Yeah, sign me up. And there are other stuns, so this is just a very strong trinket if your flame's going to be that low. But the fact that your flame is not going to consistently be that low, even in the Chains fight, just kind of pulls it back for me, and I think ultimately it ends up as C tier in my actual play and usage. Next up is Royal Summons. This is a Jester exclusive trinket and gives plus 25% stress resistance. So plus 25% stress resistance is pretty substantial, but the Jester already doesn't really have a stress issue most of the time. He's the best stress healer in the game. So it feels like this trinket is sort of adding to a strength rather than helping a weakness or improving performance. So I just don't really see much value here. It's not actively harmful or anything, but it just gets replaced as soon as something better comes along. Next up, Sacred Scribblings, plus 25% burn resistance. We've talked about these trinkets already. It's the same story. The burns are not very common outside of the sprawl. Within the sprawl, that's a fairly decent trinket to slot in, but otherwise basically pointless. So D tier. And speaking of, we have Sacrificial Host, which is the blight resistance trinket, which is 10, 20, or 25% blight resistance. Very niche player, only really shines, I think, in the Fodor, and even there, not that much. It's basically just plus 2 hope for me most of the time, but I do give it the benefit of the doubt that there are occasions where it is going to be at least somewhat impactful in a narrow use case. Next up is the Scalded Skull, which is an occultist exclusive trinket and says if flame less than 40, 8% crit chance. And this will get the B tier ranking for me despite being one of the if flame trinkets, because even if you're not running an Infernal run, 8% crit is quite a bit of crit if your flame is going to be that low, and the occultist does do some pretty cool stuff. So it feels like this is a impactful token, though I will admit that I am not very, very experienced with the occultist. It's the one character I've used the least. So this rating may change in future, but I think for now, B tier feels about right. It's definitely not something you're going to feel bad about having on your occultist, but you could definitely find better. In Infernal runs, this is just a flat 8% crit bonus. I don't think it moves into A tier, but it probably gets a lot closer, possibly sneaking in there. It just feels weird to have 8% and the anatomical map at 12% in the same ranking. So I think B tier is about the right place for it. But that is one that I'm less sure of. Next up is Seeing Sphere, which is another occultist exclusive trinket. And this one I rate in C tier, and allow me to explain, because I imagine there's some occultist people who are hating me right now. As I discussed earlier, I don't rank debuff resistance very highly. I understand that the occultist more than most makes use of it, but since I don't rate the stat very highly, this doesn't feel like a very strong trinket to me. Maybe in future, kind of future reflections, I might upgrade this and put it into the B tier, but I don't think it's going to get much better than the B tier. You know what? Actually, I'm going to change my mind. I'm going to give it the B tier. And the reason I changed my mind is I did rate the standard, which was plus 15% debuff resistance if you're rank 1 there. So if that's ranked there, I think B tier is probably where it belongs. I think that feels better. So yeah, Seeing Sphere, the occultist exclusive, plus 20% debuff resistance trinket, we'll put into B tier and call it good. Next up, we have Selfish Motivation. If Dark Impulse is equipped, plus 50% stun resistance. So this is the best of, or one of the better, and not the best, I don't think, but one of the better cultist trinkets, and it is getting the B tier. And the reason it is getting the B tier is that is a lot of stun resistance in the current state of the game. Stun resistance is pretty valuable, particularly on the chains fight. So, or primarily on the chains fight. So this definitely feels like a trinket you can carry all the way to the end, then slot in for the chains fight. However, it doesn't feel great spending 2 trinket slots for that. You'd almost rather have plus 25% stun resistance from an inert Indicia and plus 25% damage from a Raven's Reach as an example. So I think that's what keeps it in the B tier rather than maybe creeping up into the A tier next to its less powerful but less restricted counterpart in inert Indicia. Next up, we have Severed Finger, the Jester's missing digit here. Gain on Miss, Dodge Plus token. So this, for me, is going into F tier. This is a very weird trinket to set up. Like, you don't want to be missing. Missing is bad. And what it's setting up, you get a Dodge Plus token, so it's kind of odd to set up it is a defensive trinket that is hard to set up. And it's hard to imagine a good use for this unless your Jester is blind a lot. So I think this is just going to be plus 2 hope, 95+% of the time. Next up, the Shambler's Eye, plus 15% deep death blow resistance. And this is the other one that's exclusive to the occultist. And I'm going to put this into D tier. It is pulsating heart, but without the downside. And the occultist, just like all the other characters, has decent death blow resistance to start. And with positive relationships and other other effects, you can get to the cap pretty easily. So this again kind of feels like a do nothing trinket, but in the event that you have trouble getting your death blow resistance up to the 90 or the 90% cap, this will help you get there for sure. All right, next up for consideration is the sharpness charm. This is the flat damage trinket, so 5 I believe it's 5, 15, 20% damage. So that's a lot of damage on a single trinket, but it kind of like the other damage trinkets, and we're actually going to put it in at A tier right there. It suffers from the same problem the other two do. It's a lot of damage, but the top level of the trinket is quite a bit of damage, but it's never going to be a it doesn't feel like it does enough to make that S tier. I'm not going to go fight a zone 1 harvest job for the top level sharpness trinket. I might, do a quest objective or go a certain direction just to try to get it. But I don't think I would do the I don't think I'd do the zone 1 harvest child. Next up, Shimmering Crown. If relics greater than 35, apply daze on hit. So this one, kind of like a previous trinket whose name is escaping me, is going to end up in B tier. And the reason it ends up in B tier is it is an on-hit trinket, which we like. So it's an on-hit trinket applying daze, which we like. Yes, it's the I'm forgetting distracting dust. Yeah, there it is. Let's put them side by side here. Just so they can be with their buddies. So just like distracting dust, this trinket, if relics greater than 35, apply daze on hit, 25% chance. So it's basically a better distracting dust, but much like distracting dust, it has the same issue. Daze is a good token to apply, but it's not as good as stun or blind, which is what keeps it out of the A and S rank tiers. It's just, it's nice to have. You don't feel bad having it in the trinket slot, but it's just not going to do enough to get us across the line. Next up is Sickening Silence. If the Dark Impulse is equipped, plus 50% disease resistance. And this is another one that's just going to go straight into F tier, joining its compatriots here. Much like the others, this is 2 trinket slots for a resistance to an effect that is not consistently applied. You might be able to maybe make a case that this is D tier just purely for some zones, thinking about the sluice and the fodder. But the truth is, there are much better things to be doing with your trinket slots than plus 50% disease resistance. And especially as you get to the end, as the final zone, then the cultist fights in the chains, this is worthless. So honestly, just from everything about it, this is just plus 2 hope to me. Next up, the Silent Treatment. And this is, if Dark Impulse is equipped, plus 33% debuff resistance. So I've rated a couple of the other debuff resistance trinkets higher, in particular Seeing Stone and Insulating Insignia. This one, though, is going to fit comfortably in D tier. I might be, sleeping a little bit on the value of debuff resistance, but surely there are better uses for 2 trinket slots than 33% debuff resistance. Okay, next up, and one of my favorite trinkets, Skeleton's Sight. And we'll just go put that right in S tier next to its other 2 crit generating friends. Turn start, crit token, 15%. So, as discussed previously, Darkest Dungeon 2 in its current state is mostly about damage, and free crit tokens really mesh well with that. Mechanically speaking, Skeleton Sight is a 15% crit chance bonus to the character, since they can just get a crit token. And in a way, it's better than a crit bonus because you're still not dealing with any RNG once you have the crit token. It is simply there and ready to be used. There's a bit of an edge case where it may pop up on a turn where you need to do an attack that doesn't do a ton of damage or just at a bad time. But from what I've found, what I've seen, it generally delivers. And this one holds the distinction of being one trinket that I have fought a Zone 1 Harvest Child for in a very recent run. So this one has has the proof as well as the stats to back it up. Next up, we have Smoldering Hymnal. And we can go ahead and put that one in, and we'll actually put it right next to its buddy Busker's Hall here in the B tier. And exactly like Busker's Hall is a lot of the same issues in that it is on kill, extra action, 33% chance. So it's literally the same trinket, just not restricted to the Jester. And that is good, but I've cooled a lot of it. When I first encountered this, I thought this was S tier, it was the best trinket, but as I played more and more, it has the same problem. It can only trigger a maximum of 3 times in any normal encounter. And even then, mathematically, you're likely to get 1, maybe. So we're talking about 1 extra action that doesn't really excite me as much. And particularly in, say, the chains fight at the end, when you're having to deal with enemies that have, what do the chains have? Like 70, 80 health, somewhere in that ballpark? I tell how much I pay attention to them because I just blast them down. But it just doesn't feel like this does enough. Solidly B tier, I think, is a good performer and definitely not a bad trinket in the slot. But by the time you get to the end of the run, you're hoping to have something better and more impactful than maybe getting 1 extra action in a boss fight. Next up is Snappy Swig. Turn start, dodge plus token, 25% chance. We'll put this up next to its counterparts, the other defensive turn start tokens. This is just a better buttressing band. So everything I said about buttressing band holds true here. It's just very high value token provided regularly, very much worth having. But I think it is very borderline to S tier, but I don't think I would take it. I don't think I'd fight a Zone 1 Harvest Child for it. It's impactful, but not impactful enough. It's probably pretty close to best in slot, but I don't think it's all the way there. Its impact is just not comparable to, say, Reverberating Redoubt or Befuddling Sundial, or even Skeleton's Sight. It just doesn't do enough to help you win the run. But it is a very good trinket, and you're never going to feel sad about having it. Next up is Sneaker's Standard. Turn start, 25% stealth chance. So this is the other stealth trinket, and this one is going to get the B tier alongside Clandestine Cape. Even though it is closer to Covert Cloak in what it does, and that it's a turn start, the fact that it's 25% instead of 10% makes a huge difference for the Grave Robber. You're actually going to see stealth tokens from Sneaker Standard. I still think that Clandestine Cape is probably better because, again, the Grave Robber wants to start in stealth and then get back into stealth via Dead of Night. But Sneaker Standard just has enough of a proc chance to push it up into the B tier. And when you're running a tank robber, it probably is closer to A tier. But I think the in general calculation here is probably in the B tier. Next up, Sparkle Ball, my personal favorite trinket. I'll put it up right next to Dead Ringer and Clarifying Carcinet. I love Sparkle Ball. This thing is basically best in slot on Plague Doctor, and I'll fight anybody who says otherwise. Generating blinds on AoEs is amazing, and Sparkle Ball, that's all it does. Apply on hit, blind token, 15% chance. So technically it's a weaker Clarifying Carcinet, but it doesn't have any restrictions. So Sparkle Ball gets the S rank from me. I could definitely understand if someone else said it's A rank, but that would personally offend me, because Sparkle Ball is near and dear to my heart. Next up, Spoken Sharply. If Dark Impulse is equipped, plus 50% bleed resistance. So this one, I've kind of waffled back and forth between D and F tier. And I think ultimately it is going to get the D tier, but only because of the different damage over time effects. Bleed is the most easy to predict. You can slot this in for a cultist battle, then pull it out. The burn resistance is kind of the same way with the sprawl, but it feels like that's not what you need to worry about in the sprawl. So I do think I'm gonna give it the D rank, but it's very close, and I don't know if I wouldn't say it's probably F tier most of the time. And even as I'm saying this, I'm kind of talking myself back into F tier here. So, just give me a second to think here. Yeah, I think ultimately I'm going to leave it in D tier. It's just good enough, but that is a very weak D tier item. Next up, Staggering Striker, apply on hit combo, 15% chance. This is going to drift into C tier and I think stay there. So, applying on hit combo tokens is not bad. Combo tokens are nice to have for a lot of builds. But most teams that need combo points have ways to generate combo points much more reliably than an on-hit 15% chance. So it feels like Staggering Striker suffers from just not being powerful enough to be valuable. It feels like an item that you put in and then get something better and pull it out and scrap it. So yeah, C tier all the way. Next up, the Standard of the Ninth. And this is going to be up in A tier. So Standard of the Ninth, gain when hit, block plus 33%. Now, this is one that I think could conceivably be S tier. This is a Man-at-Arms exclusive gain when hit trinket, so it's very strong in the S tier. I think what holds it back is what's held back all of the defensive trinkets. Darkest Dungeon 2 is ultimately an offensive game. You need to be taking down enemies, not trying to tank it out. And the Man-at-Arms has a lot of ways to generate block and block plus tokens, so this is just adding more of what he's doing already. It's definitely not bad. You feel very good having this, but I think it just misses out compared to something like Price of Pride, which is giving something you can't get any other way, which is extra actions. Very close, though. I would not be, I could probably be convinced to move this up to S rank, but I think an A rank is where it belongs. Next up, Stiff Drink. This is the Grave Robber exclusive trinket that gives +5 speed. And like all of its counterparts, we'll just put them all together here, it is also getting the B rank. The Grave Robber is already a very fast character, so adding +5 speed kind of feels like piling on. She's already going to go first a lot of the time. This probably guarantees it, which is what gives it the B rank. It's enough to almost guarantee winning initiative, which is nice. But by the same token, I don't think winning initiative is as good as other trinket effects could be. So it's sort of it's not bad, but we'd rather she hit harder or do something else instead. Next up is Stirring Snuff, and this one pained me. But Stirring Snuff is getting the A rank instead of the S rank. So if you've watched some of my recent runs, you know I love Stirring Snuff. I'm so excited when I get it. I love putting it in on the Highwayman Dismas. But unfortunately, just when I sat down and did the math of what Stirring Snuff is actually giving, it's not actually that much damage. It's just slightly more predictable damage. I think mathematically, Gnarly Knuckles or even Sharpness Charm is probably raw better from a pure statistical standpoint. And where Stirring Snuff gets the edge is mostly in that you can predict when you can see the strength token, and that can influence your decision rather than just spreading the damage out everywhere. That being said, Stirring Snuff plus Skeleton Sight feels like an amazing trinket combination when it hits. And even if it doesn't hit, just getting strength and crit tokens regularly is very strong. But unfortunately, Stirring Snuff just doesn't meet the Harvest Child standard. It's so close, but I don't think I can justify fighting a Zone 1 Harvest Child to take it. So we're going to put it in A tier. Next up is Stone Mount. Stone Mount is plus 25% movement resistance. And just like all the other movement resistance tokens, we are going to put it into F tier. As I've said previously, movement resistance does not, or forced movement does not feel like a thing in Darkest Dungeon 2 currently. It is something that happens rarely, and when it does, it's never backbreaking. Perhaps it's different in Infernal runs, I will acknowledge that, but I've not really seen a lot of value in it. So, in general, I just don't rate this very highly. And to me, Stone Mount is basically just plus 2 hope. Next up is Storage Room Key. The Plague Doctor's plus 33% burn resistance trinket. And like all of her others, it's just going to immediately go into D tier. It's a resistance trinket. It has some usage in the Sprawl, but otherwise it's plus 2 hope, and the Plague Doctor has much better things to be doing than, mitigating burn. Next up is Strange Sapper. On hit, give a weaken token, 15%. So this one and Disarming Dagger kind of fall into the same basic mindset. This one giving weaken is, obviously it's kind of the inverse of a vulnerable token, but they both are, doing similar things. They're providing a useful token, but one that, I don't know that I would go to bat for the way I would a crit token or a blind token. It does reduce incoming damage potentially on multiple targets though, so definitely A tier. Definitely something you want to have if you have an AoE hitter. But I just think it doesn't make the standard for an S tier. Next up, Strong Shackles. Strong Shackles is on hit, apply a immobilize token, 15% chance. This is the only on-hit token that I think is genuinely bad. Strong Shackles providing Immobilize. Immobilize is very rarely, if at all, a token that you want to apply to enemies. You're better off just killing them or making them lose a turn via stun or blind. So Strong Shackle just doesn't feel like it does anything. So F tier, just plus 2 hope. Next up is Temptation. If Dark Impulse is equipped, plus 15 Deathblow resistance. I've waffled back and forth a little bit on this one as well, but I think ultimately this kind of feels like a very weak D tier. And why is that? Because if you have a character that's very close to dying or is taking a lot of damage and you don't have any other trinkets to put in, putting in a Dark Impulse in this might keep them alive. But the very limited use case on it really makes me want to put it in F tier because I just don't see myself equipping this very often. Yeah, it's somewhere between D and F. I actually, just partially because it doesn't make a third row. I'm actually going to go, kind of question myself here and go F tier. Deathblow resistance just isn't something you need to stack that much. And so the use case where you have a Dark Impulse and you have a character that needs Deathblow resistance just seems very edge and unlikely. So 95+% of the time, this is just going to be plus 2 hope. You're definitely not keeping it on for any length of time if you've got literally anything from Staggering Striker up. All right, next up, Thrilling Tablet. Combat start, gain a speed token. Well, we have a nice little collection of speed trinkets here. And basically this reads as, or translates probably better. It translates as go first on on the second round of combat. Unless you're set up to take advantage of that through a combination of maybe tokens or setups or buffs, That doesn't really mean a whole lot. I mean, don't get me wrong, going first is great, but does that change the outcome of the battle? Probably not. And that's why I put it in B tier, as it's definitely not bad. And if you've got a combo setter or a character that needs to do a buff and then, do a big hit on round 2, that's definitely a way to get it out quickly. But otherwise, just doesn't do enough, I think. Next up, Tormenting Locket. Gain when hit, dodge plus token, 33% chance. And this one is Highwayman exclusive. This one also ends up in B tier, along with a lot of the other defensive trinkets. This one is interesting because it is a dodge plus token, which has normally meant it ends up in A tier. But I actually kind of I would put it next to carved horse or toy horse, as the Highwayman isn't as fragile as the Runaway, but he's also got much more important things to be doing than kind of defensively, like kind of focusing on defending himself. You'd much rather him devoting his trinket slots to increasing his damage output dramatically so he can, kill the bad guys. So I do think you could probably make the case that in some formations this might creep into A tier. But I think for the most part, you would just as soon have your Highwayman rocking increased damage and crit chance than getting dodge tokens to mitigate getting smacked some more. Because they can't hit you if they're already dead. Next up, True Entropy. This is the randomest token trinket in the game. Turn start, add a random token. And of course, because of that, I'm putting it in C tier. I mean, it's sometimes good, it's sometimes bad, it's always something. Who the heck knows? And I just ultimately feel like True Entropy's unpredictability lends itself to just being something you slot in because you have literally no other trinkets. And then once you get some trinkets that have effects that align with what you want, you just junk this thing. Because as fun as it is to get a free crit token, it's also kind of sucks to get a free weaken token or a taunt token on somebody you don't want taunting, or a vulnerable token, or one of the other options. So C tier. Next up, Unblinking Entropy. If flame less than 40, gain block plus on turn start, 25% chance. So this one is getting a conditional B tier. And here's why. So Unblinking Entropy is really a better bouncer's belt if your flame is below 40. So in a normal run, your flame doesn't spend that much time below 40. If you're not intentionally letting it get that low, meaning that this trinket most of the time is do nothing. However, in infernal runs, this quickly becomes A tier, because that is just 25% chance block plus token. It's just a better bouncer's belt. So because of that, I think it gets the conditional B tier, recognizing that in an infernal run, it is much clearly an A tier trinket. Next up is Uncommon Seashell. This is the leper exclusive trinket that gives plus 25% max HP. And just like the other max HP trinkets, we'll actually slot it in right with them. It gives a lot of max HP, but it's sort of but who cares? Max HP does improve the leper's health pool, and he does have Solemnity to heal big chunks, but you'd much rather be tanking more with block or dodge tokens. You'd much rather be doing more damage or getting debuff resistance or one of a myriad of other things than just being a bigger sack of HP, because enemies will cut through your HP, so you're better off trying to use other trinkets. So this probably gets slotted in early, and then as soon as you have better options, this gets junked. Next up, and kind of in the same mold, is Undeserved Commendation. Combat start, 50% chance to generate a taunt token, and this is Man-at-Arms exclusive. And the fact that it's Man-at-Arms exclusive actually hurts it, which I think is kind of an odd rarity here. But it is a 50-50 chance on a character who naturally generates taunt. The Man-at-Arms' primary skill, once it's unlocked, is Retribution. He's just going to be setting up taunt tokens and reposting. So getting an extra taunt token at the start of combat just doesn't feel very impactful, and the fact that it's a 50-50 just makes it feel even worse. This one and Inevitable End kind of have a similar problem of they're generating a token the character wants to use, but the fact that it's a 50-50 just doesn't make it very good. Next up is Unwavering Standard. Combat start, gain a Block Plus token. This is going to go into B tier along with the other defensive trinkets here. In much the same way, the fact that it is a single shot Block Plus token. Actually, let me think about this some more, because I did put a Bulwark Band up here, which is a one shot. So actually, in the interest of honesty, it's actually I probably should have put A tier for this, because it is a Block Plus token. And let me think about this for just a moment here, as I think about where's yes, that's what it is. So this is actually, it took me a minute to remember why I had it in B tier, but there we go. So Unwavering Standard and Guarding Gauntlet are the same trinket, essentially. They both provide a Block Plus token, and I just rate Dodge as better than Block. I could definitely be convinced of the Unwavering Standard might be A tier, but it just feels like having a big Block token, that's it. It's a one and done trinket, mitigates one hit, which might not even be a very big hit, and doesn't mitigate dots or anything else, which is why I rate Dodge higher. So ultimately, I'm going to stick with my original call here. I think this is B tier. Next up is Vanished Vanity, and we're getting right to the end here. Vanished Vanity. If flame less than 40 plus 20% debuff resistance, this is going to go into C tier. I know I've talked through all of this whenever the debuff resistance trinkets come up, that I think I sleep on debuff resistance a little bit, and I might be underrating it. This one, though, I'm actually fairly confident in the C tier ranking because of the flame requirement. So if the fact that the flame needs to be below 40 to have this one activated means most of the time it does nothing, which means, for most runs, most builds, I'm not going to be using it. So it's basically just a gap filler until literally anything better comes along. That being said, in an Infernal run, this is probably B, potentially even A tier. It's much better if it's always on, because that's a lot of debuff resistance, don't get me wrong. It just doesn't feel like in a normal run it does much, which hence C tier. Second to last, our penultimate trinket here is Wolf's Blood, which provides +1, 2, or 4 speed. Wolf's Blood is going to slot in. I mean, it's going to go right where all the other speed trinkets are, that B tier. Speed is an interesting stat. Stacking it can be advantageous if you're looking to set up a particular combo, but it doesn't feel like a stat that's game-changing on its own. And so I think all of the speed trinkets just end up in the B tier as something that, is not a bad stat. You don't feel bad about having it, but you're looking for something better if one will come along. And finally, our final trinket, Wounding Words. If Dark Impulse is equipped, +40% damage. And this one goes up into B tier. So the fact that it requires Dark Impulse equipped definitely reduces its value, which is why it doesn't get the A tier next to its sort of comparable counterparts in Empty Stein, Gnarly Knuckles, Raven's Reach, and Sharpness Charm, and Grim Mask. You remember that Grim Mask also provides 40% damage, and all it does is negatively impact your affinity. But you could have Grim Mask and something else on. So this is just kind of a worse Grim Mask. However, it doesn't fall to the same level of bad as some of the other cultist trinkets, because it's a much more direct impact, and that is quite a bit of damage. Enough that it isn't easy to ignore. So there we have it. This is the Darkest Dungeon 2 tier list as concocted by me, Lokiorin. Let me get a good picture here. But yeah, thank you all for watching and sticking through. I know this is kind of a long process. There are a lot of trinkets in Darkest Dungeon 2, as you can see. And I'd love to hear down in the comments section below, were there any that stuck out to you as being odd choices? Any that you disagree with and think should be changed? Love to hear your feedback. And remember, like, comment, subscribe. You know the drill. Help the YouTube algorithm know that I make content you like to watch. And until next time, see ya.